It breathed, whispered, and waited. Dmitri knew this. He had spent the last 6 years as a stalker, slipping through the anomaly-riddled wastelands surrounding the Chernobyl exclusion zone. He had seen things that could drive a man mad, shadows that moved without light, voices in the static of his radio, figures in the distance that melted away when approached. But nothing compared to what he encountered on his last journey. It was supposed to be a simple job. A scientist from one of the underground labs needed a sample from an anomaly known as the Veil. It had been sighted near the Red Forest, a place even the most hardened stalkers avoided after dark. Dmitri wasn't superstitious, but he knew the risks. Still, the pay was too good to refuse. Armed with his AK-74, a Geiger counter, and an old PDA loaded with maps, he set off alone. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of trees as he moved, the air thick with radiation and decay. His footsteps crunched against the dead leaves, each step a reminder that he was utterly alone, or so he thought. As he approached the target location, his radio crackled to life. "Mitri, you hear me?" The voice was distorted, broken. He froze, gripping his rifle. His hand instinctively went to his radio. "Who is this?" he asked. Silence. Then, static-laced laughter. Dmitri spun around, his eyes scanning the trees. He was alone. He was sure of it. But the unease settled in his gut like lead. He pressed forward, reaching a clearing where the Veil anomaly shimmered like a rippling curtain of darkness. The air around it was colder, heavy with an unnatural silence. Pulling out a lead-lined container, he prepared to extract the sample. Then he heard it. A wet, dragging sound. Close. Too close. His breath caught as he turned his head slightly, his peripheral vision catching movement between the trees. A shadow, taller than any man, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that burned a deep, sickly yellow. Dmitri's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The creature stepped forward, its body flickering like a glitch in reality. It opened its mouth, no lips, just a dark abyss filled with writhing tendrils, and let out a sound that wasn't meant for human ears. A cacophony of whispers, screams, and guttural growls layered together. Dmitri fired. A full magazine, spent in seconds. The round struck, but the creature barely reacted. It only tilted its head, curious, amused. Then it moved. Faster than anything should. 1 second, it was 20 meters away. The next, it was right in front of him. Dmitri threw himself back, stumbling over roots and fallen debris. His mind raced, anomalies, artifacts, radiation, all dangers he had prepared for. But this? This was something else. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the lead-line container and bolting. His radio screamed with distorted voices. His vision blurred as the world twisted around him. The zone itself seemed to reject his presence. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs refused to carry him. When he finally collapsed near an abandoned checkpoint, the sun was rising. The creature was gone. But the whispers lingered in his head, like an infection he couldn't shake. Dmitri never returned to the Red Forest. He delivered the sample, took his payment, and disappeared from the Stalker network. Rumors spread, some said he had gone mad, others claimed he had seen something that shouldn't exist. He never spoke of what happened. But those who saw him afterward said he was different. His eyes constantly darted to shadows that weren't there. His radio was always off. And at night, when the zone was at its quietest, he could still hear it. The laughter in the static. The zone was a graveyard of forgotten things. Rusted hulks of military convoys littered the cracked roads, their metal carcasses slowly devoured by creeping vines. The air smelled of damp rot, ozone, and something foul that lingered just beyond description. Dmitri had been in the zone long enough to know its rules: never stray from the path, never ignore the warnings of fellow stalkers, and never, under any circumstances, trust the voices in the fog. But that night, the fog was everywhere. It had rolled in from nowhere, thick as smoke, swallowing the landscape in an unnatural silence. Even the distant howls of mutated beasts had ceased. Dmitri adjusted his gas mask, the cracked visor distorting the dim glow of his flashlight as he swept it across the skeletal remains of an abandoned checkpoint. Something moved. A shadow, just at the edge of visibility. He froze, raising his AK-74, scanning the dense mist. "Help me." The voice was soft, trembling, impossibly close. He knew better. Every bone in his body screamed at him to move, to run, but the voice, God, the voice sounded human. He clicked off the safety, stepping forward. "Who's there?" No answer. Then, another sound. A wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. Dmitri turned, heart hammering against his ribs. His flashlight flickered over the road ahead, empty, except for an old road sign twisted at an unnatural angle. "Help me, please." The voice came again, from the checkpoint this time. He gritted his teeth. It was a trap. He knew it. And yet. He took another step. A figure lurched from the fog. It was a man. No, it had once been a man. His face was wrong, features stretched, mouth twisted open too wide in a silent scream. His eyes were pits of blackness, reflecting nothing. The thing's limbs jerked unnaturally, its fingers twitching as it staggered toward Dmitri. Dmitri fired. The first shot tore through its shoulder, the second through its chest. It didn't fall. The fog thickened around him. More voices. More shapes shifting in the gloom. Then, the whisper reached his ear, impossibly close. "Run." He didn't need to be told twice. Dmitri turned and sprinted. The mist closed in behind him, swallowing the checkpoint, swallowing the voices, swallowing everything. By the time he stumbled into the ruins of an old outpost, gasping for breath, the fog had already begun to retreat. He dared to look back. The checkpoint was empty. No figures, no bodies. Just silence. But the whispers remained. For weeks after, Dmitri would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced he could still hear them. They seeped into his dreams, into the static of his radio, into the hollow spaces between the wind. And then, one evening, as he sat alone in a crumbling safe house, his radio crackled to life. A single, distorted voice whispered through the static. "You left me behind." The lights flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally against the walls. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of rot and ozone. Dmitri's breath hitched. His fingers tightened around his rifle. Then, from just beyond the edge of the dim candlelight, something moved. The last thing he heard before the light went out was the sound of something wet, dragging itself closer. The hollow man. The zone was an open wound, festering and alive. It bled radiation and secrets, swallowing men whole without a trace. Dmitri had spent years navigating its horrors, but nothing prepared him for the legend of the Hollow Man. It started as a rumor, a tale whispered by campfires, passed between weary stalkers over cheap vodka and smuggled cigarettes. A faceless figure that wandered the dead villages, a shadow with no voice, no breath. Some said it was a mutant, others a ghost of some forgotten soldier. But every story ended the same: those who saw it did not return. Dmitri never put much faith in stories. Until one night, when the Hollow Man found him. The village of Paramoga had been abandoned for decades, its houses stripped down to skeletons, their windows gaping like hungry mouths. Dmitri had come alone, following rumors of an untouched cache hidden beneath the ruins of an old schoolhouse. He moved carefully, the weight of his AK-74 reassuring against his back. His Geiger counter clicked erratically, but the radiation wasn't what made his skin crawl. It was the silence. The zone was never truly quiet. Wind howled through the ruins, distant howls of mutated beasts echoed from the trees. But here, nothing. As if the air itself refused to carry sound. Then came the footsteps. Slow. Measured. Just behind him. Dmitri spun, weapon raised. Nothing. His breath fogged inside his gas mask as he scanned the darkness. The pale moonlight revealed only broken walls and the twisted husks of old vehicles. He forced himself to move forward, deeper into the ruins. Then the footsteps came again. This time, he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the moonlight. Motionless. Watching. It was tall, its frame impossibly thin beneath tattered military gear. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth, featureless, a blank expanse of pale flesh stretched too tightly over its skull. Dmitri's mouth went dry. His instinct screamed at him to run. The Hollow Man took a step forward. Dmitri fired. The first shot ripped through its chest. The second shattered its shoulder. It did not bleed. It did not fall. It only kept walking. Then it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice that clawed its way directly into his mind. A whisper made of static and sorrow. You should not be here. Dmitri staggered back. His hands shook as he reloaded. The Hollow Man took another step, and with it came a wave of cold, a pressure in the air that made his ears ring. The village around him twisted. Shadows stretched, buildings flickered between ruin and something older, something wrong. For a brief, terrible moment, he saw figures standing in the windows, watching, whispering, their eyes empty voids. His vision blurred. His knees buckled. Then, darkness. He woke at dawn, lying in the middle of a cracked road, his rifle gone, his PDA dead. The village was silent once more, untouched by the horrors of the night before. But when he reached for his face, his fingers trembled. The skin beneath his jawline felt tight. Too smooth. As if something had begun to take him, piece by piece. And in the distance, from the ruins of Paramoga, the whispers called his name. The black signal. The zone breathed in static. It filled the air, crept through the trees, whispered between the ruins. The farther one ventured, the louder it became, a soundless hum that pressed against the skull, growing and twisting until it became something else. Dmitri had heard the stories about the black signal, but he never believed them. Some said it was a transmission from the heart of the zone, a ghostly radio frequency that called out to the lost. Others swore it was something far worse, an intelligence, a hunger, reaching through the waves. One night, deep in the red forest, Dmitri found it. Or perhaps, it found him. The mission was simple: retrieve an old transmitter from a collapsed bunker and return to camp. A quick job, in and out before the mutants caught his scent. The bunker was buried under layers of rust and decay, its entrance barely visible beneath a tangle of roots. Dmitri squeezed through the narrow opening, his Geiger counter clicking in protest. The air inside was thick with dust and something else, something rotten. He switched on his headlamp, sweeping the beam across the crumbling walls. Decayed equipment, shattered monitors, twisted cables hanging like veins from the ceiling. A long-dead facility. Or so he thought. Then his radio crackled. A burst of static, sharp and unnatural. Then, a voice. "Who's there?" Dimitri froze. His radio was off. The frequency was dead. And yet. The voice came again, warbled, distorted, as if spoken through crushed lungs. "Help, me." A cold sweat broke out beneath his mask. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to turn back, to never speak of this place again. But instead, he followed the voice. Deeper into the bunker. The corridor narrowed, walls closing in like ribs around a throat. The deeper he went, the more the static filled his ears, worming its way into his skull. His flashlight flickered. The air felt wrong, too thick, too heavy, as if something unseen pressed against him. Then he saw it. A room at the end of the hall, bathed in a sickly green glow. Inside, an old terminal flickered to life. Lines of corrupted text scrolled across the screen, glitching and twisting into something unreadable. And in the reflection of the monitor, he saw someone standing behind him. Tall. Faceless. Watching, ***. The moment he turned, the lights died. Darkness swallowed him whole. The next thing Dimitri knew, he was outside the bunker, lying in the cold mud, his rifle missing. His PDA displayed corrupted timestamps, as if hours had been erased. But the worst part? His radio was still off. And yet, through the static, he still heard the voice. You heard it too. The words burrowed into his mind. The signal was inside him now. And it was never going to leave. The Echo Man. The zone had a way of pulling lost things back. Sometimes, it was an old transmission looping endlessly on dead frequencies. Sometimes, it was a man. Or something that used to be one. Dimitri had been running jobs through the zone for years, but he never believed in ghost stories. Mutants, anomalies, radiation, those were real threats. The rest was just campfire talk. At least, that's what he told himself. Until he met the Echo Man. It started in an abandoned factory near the garbage. Dimitri had been searching for supplies, moving carefully through rusted catwalks and collapsed walls, when his radio clicked on by itself. A burst of static, followed by a voice. Is someone there? The voice was wrong. Hollow. Like an old recording played back on dying speakers. Dimitri hesitated, then pressed his radio. Who is this? Silence. Then, ***, his own voice ***, repeating back to him. Who is this? Dimitri's blood went cold. He switched channels. The voice followed. Is someone there? This time, it was closer. Dimitri should have left. Should have climbed back over the rubble and never looked back. Instead, he moved deeper. The factory felt wrong, the kind of wrong that pressed against the skin, made the air taste like metal. Machinery stood frozen in time, layers of dust undisturbed, as if no one had set foot here in decades. But then he saw the footprints. Fresh. Leading down into the basement. His Geiger counter clicked. The radiation was rising. And yet, something compelled him to follow. The basement was worse. Narrow corridors lined with rusted pipes. Water dripped from the ceiling, forming black puddles that seemed too deep for the cracked concrete floor. The radio crackled again. Don't go down there. Dimitri's breath hitched. The voice was his own. And then, at the far end of the hallway, something stepped into the light. It looked like a man, but its face was wrong, warped, blurred, shifting like a bad signal. A distorted reflection of himself. The Echo Man tilted its head, and the radio crackled again. "Don't go down there." But it wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from inside his head. Dimitri ran. His boots splashed through the black puddles, his breath ragged in his mask. The factory twisted around him, corridors leading back where they shouldn't, shadows moving in the corners of his vision. His radio screamed static and whispers. Then, his own voice, one last time. "You shouldn't have listened." The lights flickered. And the last thing Dimitri saw was his own reflection, stepping out of the dark. Smiling. And then everything went black. 3 days later, a new transmission echoed across the zone. A voice, weak and distorted, repeating over dead channels. "Is someone there?"